It must be very lonely to be a mechanical valve these days. No percutaneous mechanical valves. No one wants to talk about mechanical valves. I mean, actually, is there anyone here who, if he or she needed a valve, would choose a mechanical valve? All right, so I guess you should stay. Everyone else go out and get some lunch. So is there anything at all new in mechanical valves? Yes, there is. There is the notion, then leading to an idea, now with data, the notion that you can actually have a mechanical valve and have a lower level of anticoagulation, and maybe soon, for certain selected cases, no anticoagulation. That's only applicable, though, to one valve, and that's the Onex mechanical valve, which is a bileaflet mechanical valve. No one wants mechanical valves, I presume, because you don't want to be on Coumadin. I don't want to be on Coumadin. And Coumadin, as we all know, presents this Scylla and Charybdis-like situation where you've got your risk of clotting and your risk of bleeding, and where do you want to be? You want to be, if you're on Coumadin, where the INR gives you the lowest risk of both. This is 20-year-old data suggesting that in general, if you're on Coumadin, an INR of 2.5 or so minimizes your risk of the two bad things, stroke and clotting. So when it comes to mechanical valves, I thought, wow, someone actually needed to write a paper with this title. Better anticoagulation is good if you have a mechanical valve, so better is better than bad. I decided not to show any data from this because I don't think this really warranted a paper. But what about lower levels of anticoagulation with mechanical valves? Is that potentially safe? And this was a slightly earlier randomized controlled trial looking at people having a mechanical AVR. I mean, truthfully, if you're looking at a 40 or 50-year-old person who has good function and needs an AVR, you've got to think about a mechanical valve, at least for a minute. You've got to think about, do I want to set this 40 or 50-year-old person up for a reoperation down the road? Or do I want to give him a mechanical valve with Coumadin? And the question here is, if he gets a mechanical valve, what will happen if we aim for an INR of 1.5 to 2.5 on your right, instead of going closer to 2 to 3? And the answer in this case, with lower risk patients, was an INR of 1.5 to 2.5, reduced the risk of bleeding. That's no surprise. But what's good news is it did not increase the risk of thromboembolism. So that was some preliminary data. After that study came out, people started to think, well, what about just forget about warfarin or Coumadin because we have all the novel oral anticoagulants? And there was a randomized controlled trial of dabigatran versus warfarin in patients with mechanical heart valves, published in the New England Journal. A little bit surprising, but the outcome was very simple. In one sentence, warfarin was safer. Warfarin had a greater freedom from thromboembolism, warfarin in blue, dabigatran in yellow, and warfarin had a greater freedom from bleeding. So at least in this study, with mechanical valves, novel oral anticoagulants, not an option. So if we're not going to switch the anticoagulant, let's maybe talk about a different valve. And this is the Onex valve. It's a bileaflet mechanical valve. It looks very similar to other bileaflet mechanical valves, but these are the features listed that make it somewhat different. And basically what these features do is two things. They improve hemodynamic performance, and they reduce thrombotic and thromboembolic complications. And we have data. I should mention earlier that some of the data I'll show is from John Puskas. But first, if you've got a new valve, you have to prove, forgetting about the anticoagulation for a minute, you have to prove that this new valve works as well as old valves. So the answer is yes, it does. Freedom from thromboembolism with the Onex valve, excellent. Freedom from bleeding, excellent. Freedom from endocarditis, also great. But here was something that was surprising. The valve worked fine, but this was an observational study looking at people in South Africa who got mechanical valves who just didn't take their Coumadin. You know, not a great idea, not recommended, but the authors of this study said, you know what's interesting? We've got this group of people who have this Onex valve. They're supposed to be taking Coumadin, and they're not. I wonder what happened to them. You know, did they all have strokes? Did they all thrombose their valves? What happened to these people who just didn't take Coumadin? And the answer is not much happened to them. They did pretty darn well with a mechanical valve without anticoagulation. And that led to this study called PROACT, some of which has been published. The idea with this study was to answer the question, if you've got the Onex mechanical valve and we either reduce or eliminate anticoagulation, what's going to happen to you? Are you going to do as well as these sort of observational things that happen in South Africa, or is there going to be a risk? So the purpose of this study, which was an FDA study, was to determine the safety and effectiveness of less aggressive anticoagulation therapy with this bileaflet mechanical valve. And it was framed when we just had the 2006 heart guidelines. You heard the heart valve guidelines from 2014, but 2006 guidelines, in effect, when this was designed, suggested if you get a mechanical valve, you want an INR of 2 to 3, and you want to take aspirin. So that was the background for a randomized controlled trial. The patients, no matter which arm they were in, low anticoagulation or standard, for the first 3 months got standard anticoagulation, and then they were transitioned if they were in the test group. Primary endpoint of this study of a bileaflet mechanical valve, just what you'd expect, basically the sum of all the bad things related to bleeding and stroke and death. There are 3 different groups. The first is low-risk AVR. So you get a mechanical AVR, you're randomized to warfarin or just aspirin plus clopidogrel. Second group, high-risk AVR, and this is the one we'll talk about. High-risk AVR, you get an INR of 1.5 to 2 plus aspirin, or an INR of 2 to 3 plus aspirin, and that's the one we'll focus on. And then there's an ongoing study of mitral valves. In each case, the control group gets standard anticoagulation. So what we're going to talk about is the group that has data available. This study is basically completed. High-risk AVR patients. High-risk AVR randomized to an INR of 1.5 to 2, or high-risk AVR randomized to an INR of 2 to 3. Question is, who does better? So what is a high-risk AVR? For this study, it's people who are having concomitant, who are not having concomitant procedures, or who are. They're adults, and they have other features, like they've got AF, a low EF, or any of these features. In addition, they may have a hypercoagulable state, as defined here, or they may be proven to be poor responders to aspirin or to clopidogrel. So these are the people who are at high risk for thromboembolic events getting an AVR. Well, you compare these high-risk patients, control group got standard anticoagulation, test group, lower INR. These are younger people. They're relatively high risk for thromboembolism, but they're in their 50s. And they have similar distribution, control group versus the low anticoagulation group in all of these different factors. The follow-up extends to about 4.5 years. Now, did they achieve the INRs that we were supposed to get? In the control group, the mean INR was 2.5, that's in red, and the low anticoagulation group had a mean INR of 1.89 in blue. So we truly are comparing lower rate of anticoagulation versus a higher. The INR distribution between those randomized to low INR in red, clearly they did achieve the lower INR versus standard anticoagulation in yellow. And what was the answer? The answer was shocking. Lower INR, you don't bleed as much. That was the good news piece, as expected. If you are in the test group, you have an INR under 2, you have fewer major and minor bleeding complications. And there was no increase in thromboembolism. So test group, here in blue, versus control group, greater freedom for major and minor bleeding, and no significant change in thromboembolic complications, meaning you can have an INR under 2 with this mechanical valve in an aortic position, and you're not going to have more thromboembolic events, but you will have less bleeding. So I showed you that curve earlier, suggesting that in general, if you're on warfarin, you want an INR of 2.5, but with this valve, it's a little bit different. In this group of people having aortic valve replacement, an INR between 1.5 and 2 gave you the lowest combined risk of bleeding and thromboembolism. So with this bileaflet mechanical valve, the hypothesis was proven. The treatment group, meaning an INR of 1.5 to 2, was not inferior. They met all the standard objective performance criteria, and they had less bleeding. So what does this tell us at the end? a lower INR with the Onex mechanical valve in the aortic position is completely acceptable, reduces your risk of bleeding, and does not increase your risk of thromboembolism. And what this makes me do is to look at my 40 to 50-year-old patient or even 50 to 60-year-old patient and talk about this. Many of them will still choose a bioprosthetic valve because they don't want any Coumadin in it at all. But I think you have to tell your aortic valve patient who's younger, there is an option to have a mechanical valve with a lower INR, and we hope in the coming 2 or 3 years we'll find out perhaps the low-risk AVR patient, perhaps that patient can be managed with a mechanical valve and no Coumadin whatsoever, but we don't know that yet. Thank you.